Hello, good evening. Okay, the reveal. Tonight I'm going to talk a bit about how fonts are magic. So hello, fellow letter nerds. I am really happy to be here tonight talking about my absolute favorite topic, fonts, if you can guess. I'm really into type. But first, this is me. So I'm Alanna Munro. I run a local independent type foundry called Arcane Type Foundry. And at this foundry, I design typefaces for my library that anyone can purchase a license to. And I also make specific custom typefaces and word marks for clients as well. It's pretty enjoyable work. I've been doing it for over 10 years now, so I really like it. And I think from the first moment that I actually started using fonts, I understood that there was something really special about them. So there's a point in the human experience, I think we've all experienced it before, where we open up a document and we click on that font menu. And any font in that menu could really display the words that we want to write down, but choosing one means that we might need to consider our personality or our mood, or possibly even the intention behind the words that we want to write. This experience happened for me back in 2002 when I got my very first computer. Look how beautiful and gray it is. Isn't it lovely? And it came with about 20 pre-installed fonts on it, which initially felt like a lot of options. I mean, look at all these. There's so many. But as I experimented with making booklets and posters, I started to feel a little bit limited. So I searched the internet and I came across a website called DaFont. You may have heard of it. It has free fonts on it, guys. And I downloaded this font called Redhead Goddess, which teenage Alanna I absolutely vibed with it. I loved it so much. I use it on everything. So eventually, I decided to follow this passion and go into graphic design. And I learned more about typography, and I really discovered how wide the world of typefaces could really be. And when I took a type design class, I also discovered just how little I actually knew about the shapes of the letters that I had been reading for my entire life. I started learning a little bit more about the subtlety that could go into the design of these letter forms. And really, as I started to make my own fonts, I believed more and more that fonts are magic. So the shapes of the letter forms that we use are a really powerful tool to influence our audience. But this evening, I want to focus on an often overlooked aspect of fonts, how we use them as pieces of software. Some very magical things can happen when we use open type features in very unexpected ways, or embrace emerging formats like color fonts or variable fonts, or even commission a custom font to do something really specific in your project. So before I get too deep in that, I just want to get us all on the same page and explain a little bit behind how some of the magic is working when you use a font on your computer. So a font is a binary file, and if you open it in a text editor, it looks kind of like this. I don't know what this means. I don't know if you know what this means, but the computer knows what it means, which is what matters in this case. And it can use this information to display the font on the screen for you. And in order for this to work, the type designer has to include certain information in the font file, and the computer then decodes it and displays it on the screen. Probably the most well-known thing that a type designer includes in the font file are the vector outlines. And these are basically just the drawing of each letter. Each character in a font is recorded as a series of points and handles that each have their own coordinates. And this is what allows the shape to be infinitely scalable, because these coordinates can basically be plotted onto a graph or a space of any size. The other half of what you see in the font is spacing and kerning information. Spacing is going to be the default amount of space on each side of the character, and type designers work really hard to make sure that spacing works as well as it can in every single situation. But sometimes the shapes we're working with don't always cooperate. I'm looking at you, diagonal letters, not cooperating. So we add in kerning. And kerning is basically just a list of spacing exceptions that are for certain pairs of letters that are not cooperating and playing nice with their friends. So fun fact, in a font that has just 26 uppercase and 26 lowercase letters, you have to check 2,704 letter combinations to make sure all of those work. So kerning can be a bit of a tedious process, but it's worth it for that perfect spacing every single time. A piece of information that you may not see or notice in the font file are the vertical metrics. These basically set the default leading for the font and make sure that accent marks don't get cut off in certain situations. Another thing you may not notice is the Unicode values. These things are pretty cool. Very important, very magical. Unicode allows us to switch from one font to another without the letters getting all jumbled up. So each character in a font is assigned a Unicode value. So like the uppercase is 004F. And when you switch to another font, it'll display the vector coordinates in that 004F spot. So if you do that right, you get another capital O. Good for you. And the final part I want to talk about are the open type features, because this is where we can start doing some really cool things with our fonts. And open type features are little sections of code that tell the computer when to swap a character with a different version of that character. A common example is to correct design issues, like when two letters collide in an undesirable way. So with standard ligatures, the type designer can draw an alternate version of these colliding letters that will be displayed anytime these letters appear next to each other. So the code for this, little code down at the bottom, basically says if these two letters appear next to each other, swap their drawings for this other drawing that I made, which is so much better. I used some OpenType features in a recent project where I created a custom handwriting font for John Flufog's shoes. I don't know if any of you know of those shoes. They're very cool. And one of the main challenges with handwriting fonts is making them look realistic and authentic. So much of the handwriting quality that you're seeing does come from the drawings themselves, but it can start to really look like a font when two of the same letter appear right next to each other and they're identical. So thankfully, we can draw alternate versions of these letters and use the contextual alternates feature to swap them automatically. So we can draw these alternates, turn on the feature, and the code can detect when two of these similar letters appear next to each other, and then swap out the second one with the alternate character. And this happens all automatically as you're typing, so the person using the font doesn't actually have to do any extra work. I've also used the standard ligatures feature in my font Kiyoshi. If you type up, up, down, down, left, right, BA start, you are rewarded with a piece of cake. So when making a font inspired by retro video games, I couldn't resist using the most famous cheat code known to gamers. And this is definitely not how you're supposed to use standard ligatures feature, but breaking the rules of open type features is really where things start to get interesting. So this project, the Polite Type project, is aimed at fighting cyberbullying. And the idea is that even if you wanted to write hurtful words, the font itself would prevent you from doing so. This font's simply using standard ligatures to replace hurtful words with better alternatives by saying with the feature code, if this series of letters appears, replace it with this other drawing, which contains the full alternate word, or in cases where no kinder word exists, you can replace the offending words with a texture. So on any website that uses this font to display the text, it simply wouldn't be possible to write hurtful things. You see, I tried. It didn't work. So the Polite Type is an example of a font that has been very specifically customized to solve a certain issue. Speaking of customized fonts, custom fonts have been getting a lot of attention lately. I don't know if you've noticed. It seems like a lot of very large companies have been commissioning their very own brand font, and they're like, this is all ours. We like it. But custom fonts don't always have to be this huge, high-budget project, and there are actually some very practical reasons to get a custom font made. And that's the ability for custom fonts to become a solution for a design challenge. That was the case with this custom emoji font that I created. I worked on this project with local book design studio Page 2 to fill a need for a very specific situation. So there was a book they were working on, and it was written in a style that used a whole bunch of emojis throughout the text. So putting in those kind of classic colorful emojis would have been a bit distracting to the reader and also increase printing costs because now you got to print the interior of the book in color. So to solve that, we created a set of emojis that were designed to fit within the chosen book text, both visually and technically. And instead of making individual images, we put them in a font format. So this made typesetting these emojis as easy as just like changing the font and selecting the emoji that you needed. And this project, while this project likely allowed one lucky graphic designer to have a much better night's sleep, custom fonts can also address larger issues in our community as well. So customizing existing fonts can help bridge a very large gap that currently exists for Indigenous languages. Many Indigenous languages don't have very many choices of fonts that actually support all the characters needed to display these languages properly. So when the Niska people were putting together a website with design agency partners in Haws, Jinto Nord was selected for the font for the project, but it was missing some characters needed to display the Niska language, these ones right here. So I worked with partners in Haws and made a custom version of Jinto Nord that included the necessary characters, which enabled them to display their language on their website and support this community in being able to express their visual identity without font limitations. Another project that aims to help a specific community is Atkinson Hyperlegible. The Braille Institute set out to create a font that was specifically designed to help people with low vision have an easier time reading. Unfortunately, Latin type design contains a lot of characters that look really similar to each other, and if you can't see them very clearly, they can be really hard to distinguish, and they lead to confusion or misinterpretation of the text, or just a lot of fatigue while you're reading. So legibility can be really important. And because this font was custom, the Braille Institute could tailor it very specifically for low vision legibility and test it within their own community to make sure that it was achieving their goals. And then also, because they owned it at the end, they could make it available for their community as a free download. So I think eventually this project was sort of brought into the Google Fonts thing, so I think everyone has access now to this through Google Fonts. So custom fonts have the benefit of both greater control over the design and features, and also greater control over how the font is made available to the community members or kept as an important brand asset for a company. And speaking of fonts for a specific community, look how colorful this one is. This font is called Gilbert, which was first released in 2017 to honor the creator of the Rainbow Pride flag, Gilbert Baker. And it made available to everyone this really vibrant, colorful font, especially for people who may not have the skills to create something like this in professional design software. So it's fully live editable text, and it uses multiple colors and transparency to create this really fun design. And this is kind of the power of color fonts, is that you can type in all of these bright colors without having to know anything about Photoshop or InDesign or Illustrator. So a few years ago, I wanted to find out how to make one of these color fonts. So I used Kiyoshi, one of my fonts, as a test subject. It's my little guinea pig. And I discovered color fonts will display the default color palette. And it's still a little bit tricky to modify that default color palette in desktop apps, but on the web, it's no problem. So keeping that in mind, and then also David Jonathan Ross, who is now mentioned for the second time this evening, has built a little web app tool that lets the user drop in a color font file, and then you can customize the color palette and export a new font that you can use in your desktop apps. So it's still totally possible. You just need to use this little website to customize your color fonts, and you can make them whatever colors you want. All right. The future of fonts is variable, and the future is already here. How many of you have used a variable font? I'm curious. Oh, nice. Okay, a number of you. Excellent. I love variable fonts. I think they're super cool. They're relatively new, but widely supported now. Pretty easy to use. And they have the idea behind them has existed in the type design process for a long time. This is how we've been making fonts for a long time. So I'm going to explain a little bit just about how they're made. So in a large font family like this is my font Tofino. These are half the styles. There are 74 styles in total. And it looks like it would be maybe a lot of work to sit there and draw all of these, but the truth is that type designers are kind of big cheaters. We don't sit there and draw every single one of these styles. That's way too much work. I'm not going to do all that. So what we can do is draw the extreme versions of the letters and use something called interpolation to help us draw the rest. Remember those vector outlines I was talking about earlier? So if we have 2 or more sets of these vector coordinates, and we can export anything in between through interpolation. So to do this, we create an axis. In this case, I've got 0 to 1,000, and then we put drawings along it somewhere. So I put a thin drawing at the 0, heavy drawing at the 1,000, and then I've asked it to create what would this look like at 450, and it's kind of given me kind of like a regular weight, I'd say. So using this, we can export as many styles as we want from these 2 drawings that we've made. It's pretty magical, I think. And we don't have to stop at one axis. We can add more and get a cube of interpolation. It's pretty awesome. On this drawing here, it's a little complex, but anywhere where there's a blue section is where I've actually drawn the letter forms, and then inside that 3-dimensional cube, you could pick any point and basically get a style there. And the very exciting thing about variable fonts is that you guys all now have access to the whole cube of interpolation. So you have, in a variable font, a variable font is every style in one file, which is also a very catchy tagline, and I don't know why more people don't use it. The styles are usually accessible using some kind of slider, or you can just input a number as well, accessible in CSS, etc. This is a website called Font Gauntlet, where you can drag and drop a variable font and just test out the different axes that you have available. For practical things, this branding project for Tokyo Dome City uses a variable font animation in a really fun way, I think. It was done by Andform and type designer Toshio Magari, who really used variable fonts to the fullest, I think, in this project. The custom font he created covers a really wide range of weights and widths, and then animated super dynamically, which is perfect for displaying on these really large screens around the sports arena that anchors this area. Super fun. Animating between styles has a huge potential, especially when we can get creative with the axes. We don't have to stick with the classic weight and width and italic. We could have an axis that goes from sans to serif, or from straight to kind of wiggly, as you see on the bottom. So we can really do a lot of interesting things with these axes and then animate between the styles that we create really easily. So this project here is called Climate Crisis Font, and they tied the master drawings directly to a data set of how the ice caps have melted over the last 40 years, and then the projection of how they will continue to melt into the future, so that they can then use that variable font to animate between the unmelted and the melted styles and create a really strong visual of what happens to our ice if we don't take action. So we end up with a font that actually melts like ice without having to do a lot of complicated animation. You can type whatever words, put it in this font, animate it pretty easily. So digital fonts have come a really long way since I was a teenager with a copy of Photoshop in 2002. And we have more opportunities than ever to bring the magic of fonts into our projects. And when we use font technology more creatively, fonts become a really powerful tool for dynamic, expressive, and inclusive designs. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where the future of fonts will take us, and I hope you guys are too. That's it. Thanks, nerds.
Thank you, Alanna. So I think whatever level of design and whatever level of typographer, as in type user you are, there's probably some new stuff Alanna introduced there. So do we have any questions for Alanna, either about using type or making type? Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, how widely supported are all these cool features? Like, is there ever an issue of, backwards compatibility where you can't use some of these features in some places?
Yeah, definitely. So color fonts, you may need a couple different formats. So like Adobe programs like a certain format, the SVG, and web browsers like the Color V1 format. So, but they're pretty easy to export both. So type designers usually have both on hand if they've created a color font. And variable fonts are pretty much just sort of everywhere. They're pretty easy, and open type features have been supported forever, so they're totally fine. Yeah, so most of this you can, all of it really, you can do now. You don't have to wait.
Yeah.
I have to ask you also, with the advances of AI, how much of AI you can use to add that animation or feature, especially with things like variable fonts, or in your work, anywhere that you use it or not using it.
Yeah, for sure. I purposely kind of left AI out because it's a very large topic and I only had 20 minutes. I don't use a ton of AI in my work yet. AI has so far been, its level of making fonts is about the same as its level of getting hands right. So but it's getting there. And there's actually, I Love Typography is running a AI and fonts conference very soon. So if you're curious about that, there's an online conference that they're running that will go much deeper into topic of AI and how that's gonna make its way into the font industry, which I think it will. And I hope that it helps make the tools a lot faster or easier to create things more quickly. But I hope that it doesn't take over the thinking part and the making part of making type, because I think that's important to keep human brains in the loop on that one.
Yep.
I was going to ask, so for example, if I wanted to design my own typeface, or if I'm choosing a typeface to work with, and I am presented with the option of either using a font that ends with a OTF or a TTF, what is the functional difference between those two?
Good question. I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure there's not much of a difference anymore. They were sort of, when they were created, they were kind of coming from different angles, but they've sort of ended up in a similar situation. Both will generally work in most places. I don't know, maybe Kenneth knows more about both.
Yeah, there's more of a historical reason for it, but at this point, there's no difference for almost any user. Some are wrapped as like their true type flavored open type files, so they have been produced in a way that historically would have been called true type and would have been different, but I think was functionally the same for end users at this point. So
yeah, pretty much.
There was a window of time where like even still web fonts on Android needed like true type files specifically, but that's long past. Like now some people are still producing both versions because that's what they always did, but it doesn't really make any difference to end users in almost all cases.
Yes, what he said. Thank you for the rescue.
Yeah. Jordan, you had a question, right?
Is there a difference between designing a font for screen and designing a font for printing, like in the modern age?
Not really, unless you are intentionally trying. So if you really are trying to create, like, let's say, like the phone book is a great example, which we don't print anymore. Anyone remember phone books? Yeah, I sat on them usually as like a little stool at dinner time to make me a little taller. But, they were very aware that in that particular situation, you're printing things very small on not great paper with inks that would spread quite a bit. So in that case, if you have a case where you know that you might have an issue you want to fix with the type, so you could add ink traps to help catch some of that ink spread so it stays readable in the case of the phone book. But so if you're intentionally trying, you can. definitely designed specifically for like print. And for web, like screens are so good these days, there's not really a point in designing differently for them necessarily. They're going to look very similar to print. So we mainly design typefaces that work for everything.
Yeah, I mean, we also have like a risograph printing, like some fonts won't look as good there if you try to do it at small sizes, but most people aren't printing long volumes that way. But we do have a lot of risograph prints over there, right? So if you haven't grabbed any yet, make sure to take some from our collection table over there. Yeah, do we have, I think, you want to do one more question? We have one more question, yeah?
So when you're making a custom font, like for characters that aren't there, like you said, like you did for, I believe it was Ginto Nord, do you need like permission from the original creator in order to have those new additions, or like is it like a special case type thing?
Yeah, for sure. So in the case of Ginto Nord, where we're adding Indigenous language support, for that one, it was mostly accent marks, but we do have to get in touch with the original designer. We need permission to modify a font, and that usually states that in the license file. Unless it's an open source typeface, then you can modify it as much as you want. But yes, if it is a commercial font and it says in the license that you can't modify, we just emailed them and they were like, "This sounds great. We would love to support more languages. Go ahead. You can definitely modify this font for this reason." So, I mean, type designers so far, all the ones I've met have been some of the nicest people I've ever met. So, don't be afraid to reach out to type designers. We're not scary. We don't bite.
And thank you very much to one of the nicest type designers you'll ever meet, Alanna Munro. Thanks, Alanna.
Thank you.